Welcome to Journeys Through Sociology, a series of interviews with the Executive Committee of the International Sociological Association. I'm your host, Lale Bebohanyan, and today we are joined by Dr. Habibul Khondker. Dr. Khondker is a professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi. He's originally from Bangladesh, but went on to earn his PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in the US, before going on to teach at the National University of Singapore for over 20 years. Dr. Khondker has worked on a wide range of research projects. He's worked extensively on globalization, including his most recently published book, Globalization East-West. Most of his work is focused on Singapore and the United Arab Emirates, where he's worked on a range of issues relating to civil society, democratization, and gender. Most recently, he's been working on a research project on migration in the UAE. And of course, we're extremely fortunate that he's currently serving on the executive committee of the ISA. Dr. Khondker, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure being here and being able to talk to you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Khondker, actually, I'd like to begin today by asking you, what aspect of your work as a sociologist would you say you're currently most excited about?
I'm most excited about the issues of development, socioeconomic development, which I look at in comparative terms. I have been interested in issues of socioeconomic development for quite some time. As you know, I was born in Bangladesh in a middle-class family, and after finishing my education at Dhaka University, I moved to Canada and then to US for higher studies. So in a way, I was born in a periphery. I moved to a semi-periphery and then to a core. Then, that life experience mirrored my academic and intellectual interests. And then I came back to Singapore, which was at that point a semi-periphery. So I got interested in the issues of comparative development.
And you would say that it was kind of the contrast between the economic conditions in those various places that really got you interested in that.
Absolutely. Having lived in very different kinds of societies with different political culture, different economic trajectories, I naturally became interested in the studies of comparative development.
So I think, Dr. Khondker, that this is perhaps one of the interesting things about your work, the way that your own trajectory has taken you, as you say, from Bangladesh to Canada to the US, to Singapore, and now to the UAE. Could you perhaps in this trajectory identify for us what you would say are maybe 3 reasons that you were drawn to sociology?
In fact, the first reason I was drawn to sociology was somewhat accidental. I got a copy of this book by Peter Berger, Invitation to Sociology. And having read that book, I was drawn to reading C. Wright Mills, and that got me interested in sociology. And I always looked at sociology, as a kind of transaction between biography and history. And I reflect on my own biography to understand sociological processes. So that was one reason. The second reason was, I was growing up in Bangladesh. I saw a country being born. The nationalist movement resulted in a war of independence. So I was drawn to the issues of political sociology. And in those days, Soviet Union was very active promoting their brand of Marxism in many developing countries. So we got to read a lot of Marxist literature, very mechanistic, sort of discussion of Marxism, almost free of cost. So I had a lot of books, and then the sociology department at Dhaka University was quite Marxist. So, we had a good training in sociology in those days. And then as I moved on to Canada, in those days, I was introduced to the writings of Barrington Moore, Immanuel Wallerstein, the Theda Skocpol to some extent, who was a graduate student, I think at that time, this was late 70s. And Canadian University, Carleton was quite a new Marxist department at that time. So it's one thing that led to the other. And I was quite intrigued by, the historical sociology that I was exposed to when I went to Pittsburgh. And there I met Roland Robertson, who was a big guru of globalization studies at that time. So all these very different experiences, the sort of variegated exposures shaped my mind. And I became, so to speak, a comparativist with some interest in political sociology, with some interest in historical sociology, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in some ways you would say then it was this back and forth between reading the works of these people and actually the conditions that you were seeing around the world that kind of got your sociological imagination flowing.
Absolutely. Okay. And when I had to choose my PhD topic, I reflected back, and as I was studying in Dhaka University, we saw a famine in 1974. And for my PhD topic, I wanted to explore why did that famine happen, and I could immediately see the famine was caused both by international forces. The U.S. withheld a shipment to Bangladesh because it had some very minor economic transaction with Cuba, and then there were domestic issues. So I began to look at sociological issues as more complex. You cannot have just one set of explanation. We need to look at multiple explanations to explore why things happen and why did famine happen in Bangladesh and what could have been done and what was done. So those are issues, that I became interested in. And my recent interest in migration studies are related to poverty, inequality, certain trends in globalization that cause displacement, but also opportunities for people to explore and improve their life chances.
Mm. So this issue of famine in Bangladesh is one of the earliest things that you worked on, and now I know more recently you've been working on issues of migration. In between those two projects, can you give us a sense of some of the other issues that have interested you sociologically speaking?
In a theoretical sense, I have always been interested in the issues of humanism. I've been interested in the issues of universalism. And those are issues that were brought up, even in the discussions that I had with my parents. I'm lucky to have both parents who were fascinated by literature, so we had a lot of books at home. And we grew up on books, and I used to have long discussions with my mother, who was a big fan of Rabindranath Tagore. And I was exposed to all those humanistic traditions. And then as I studied Marxism and sociology, I could see a connection that deep down they're interested in human condition, how to improve human situation, amidst constraints of globalization and so on. So I found a common theme running through, the poets, great poets of Bengal, the writers of Bengal, and sociologists, coming from Europe and wherever they came from.
So, Dr. Khondker, this actually, it gives us a fascinating view of some of the potential that you see in sociology, the possibilities that you see in using sociological frameworks to understand these kinds of human conditions and the factors that shape them. But can you also perhaps give us a sense of some of the challenges, maybe identify for us 3 challenges that you faced as a sociologist?
Of course, there are many challenges, but if I have to understand 3 challenges, one of the challenges that sociologists face, especially I'm thinking of sociologists from the third world, that many of them, kind of start in anonymity and they end their career in obscurity. But others, who become famous, get some attention, they're often fated to play a stereotyped role of a critique of Western hegemony, especially knowledge production, Western imperialism, cultural imperialism in particular. And I want to break out of that because I think that's a legacy of colonialism. And today I try to look at and transcend, the dichotomy between the West and the East. And I think, rather than launching a blanket critique of the West, we should take a more universalistic position and look at the problems where they are. The problems could be in the local situation, the problems could be in the international arena. We have to chase the problems as they occur. And the second challenge, I think, is the competing demands that all sociologists, at least in my situation or from the point of view that I have, that very often we need to compromise. We cannot speak as freely as we wish we could because there are constraints, constraints of all kind, institutional constraints through which we have to navigate very carefully. And for a sociologist of my type, who I call myself a roving sociologist, moving from place to place, that I often feel that I'm doubly marginalized. I'm marginalized from the society I hail from and the society I work in because I don't belong to any particular place. So this is a problem, but it also creates an opportunity. Since I do not have a stake in any national system, I'm forced to be more cosmopolitan. And that's why I'm naturally inclined to the studies of globalization, migration, diasporic communities, and so on. So every time I face a difficult situation, a problematic situation, I look for an opportunity lurking behind that problematic situation.
Okay. And you think that your own experiences, as you say, as a roving sociologist, has given you kind of a perspective that enables you to think about these issues like migration or these kinds of flows across global boundaries, across national boundaries.
Absolutely. And, as we study those very empirical real-life situations, and I think sociology should do more of that so that they remain relevant in a competitive world of intellectual currents. It also generates some kind of intellectual debate. Deep down, I think that one of the most important problems in sociology, as in other fields of social science, is the dichotomy between universalism and cultural or national relativism. We need to take both global and national context at the same time, and this is what I have learned from my research on 1974 famine. And the point is how to strike a balance. Both are important. One cannot sacrifice one for the other. We cannot be critical partially. If we want to launch a critique of the West, of the global system, we should not overlook the tyrannies that exist in local institutions, in the cultures we grew up in, and so on. So we should be even-handed in our critique of whatever that needs to be criticized. But then that leads to another problem, and this is a problem that I've been facing, that how to be critical without being judgmental. Because sometimes, we have knee-jerk criticisms, which are basically judgments made on issues. So I think that's a very, very thin line that we need to be careful about.
The line between sociological critique and a kind of moral judgments.
Kind of moral judgments, exactly.
Wonderful. So, and would you say that would you say that the kind of challenges that you've identified, do you think that in some ways are they universal challenges for sociologists? Are they challenges that are in many ways exacerbated in the developing world?
No, I think these are sort of universal problems because at one point I kind of took interest in understanding great American sociologists, starting from Sorokin and so on. And most of the, sociologists in those days were émigré sociologists. So they had a perspective, which some of the native sociologists lacked. And then I looked at, the biography of people like Immanuel Wallerstein and others. They moved around the world a lot. So they knew the world that they were talking about. And I think that makes a lot of difference. Some people are armchair theorists. They theorize without leaving home. But there are sociologists that I'm quite impressed by, sociologists who move around, see the world as it works. And then they try to reflect on, comment on, engage with this actual society that they have seen. And I think I look at sociology as a commentary on society. So people who look at sociology as history of the present is something that I can identify with.
And I think, though, that this issue of the potential of a roving sociologist, as we'll call it now, as you've coined it, it also, though, it comes back to the issue of the unequal distribution of resources among sociologists globally, because clearly the capacity to rove globally and be able to kind of cross national boundaries in those ways is an opportunity that in many ways is limited to among sociologists globally, no?
Well, it's a matter of economic resource, but also a matter of intellectual resource, you know. If you have the ability, I don't think it's really all that difficult to move around these days. People can go and expose themselves to different kinds of societies, even with a limited budget. And, you know, I mean, teaching sociology has become a globalized profession. So, you know, one could move around and find a job. The problem is some people don't want to leave home. And I urge people to move around, see the world as it is, and then engage with that world from various angles, you know, drawn from sociological theories. You know, and I always looked at classical sociological theories as great source of inspiration, because those guys, they looked at society, they theorized, and they never, you know, they never shied away from commenting on what was going on. And I think that's very important.
Right. Well, Dr. Khondker, this is, you know, we've gotten a sense of your trajectory, your journey through sociology, so to speak, some of the potentials or possibilities you see within sociology, some of the challenges that you faced. I'd like to kind of end on asking you, if you had not become a sociologist, what do you think you might have liked to do or to be?
For me, that's an easy question, because in my sociology, I look at myself as a comparativist. So I like to compare situations, compare cultures, compare societies, compare gender. And in my other kind of reincarnation, if you will, I write for the newspapers. I don't write as frequently as I should, but I write, you know, at least once a month, a column for a popular newspaper in Bangladesh, and sometimes I write for other newspapers. And I comment on issues of the day. And I think sociologists need to engage with public issues. Firstly, to make sociology relevant. And I always identify myself as a sociologist, that so-and-so is a sociologist, so that people know that sociologists can comment on issues like 9/11, which I have written on recently. And sociologists can write on political issues, cultural issues, a wide range of issues. They are within the grasp of sociology.
So in that sense, your work as a journalist, in many ways, you see that as an extension of, as a form of public sociology, so to speak.
I see that. I'm quite fascinated by this whole debate on public sociology, and I think sociologists should come forth and engage with public issues.
And do you experience a difference in terms of the work that you do as a sociologist and when you kind of put on the cap of a journalist? Is there some shift that you make in how you approach the two?
I think I look at, because I am also quite interested in reading, you know, good journalistic pieces, you know, whether they appear in New York Times or in Guardian or New York Review of Books, wherever, you know. And good journalism is actually sociology without footnotes. So, you know, I mean, we can learn a lot from very perceptive, you know, journalists, and because they know the field, they know what is going on in their real life, and they have experiences. So I greatly admire, you know, journalists, and in my writing as a journalist or part-time columnist, you know, I try to write in a very simple, jargon-free manner. And of course, I don't know many jargons to begin with. English is not my first language, so that's an advantage in a way. You know, I write in a very simple way to access, you know, the larger audience. And I often get feedback from all kinds of readers, and that makes my day.
So when you engage in journalism, then you, as you say, you attempt to avoid kind of academic jargon in an effort to kind of speak to a larger public. Is there anything, though, that you think that you're being a sociologist, is there a particular perspective or advantage that brings to the way in which you do journalism?
I think what I gain in sociology, and I can use very successfully in my columns, that I take a very critical stance. And I try to argue that sometimes things are not as simple as they look like. So I try to go behind what is there. And this is what I think is very sociological exercise, that we have to look beyond the immediacy of the situation. And I'm sometimes quite bold in my assertion, and I make all kinds of arguments, and I try to back them up. So I enjoy that, and which I cannot get away with in sociology. Well, give 2 more footnotes, and when I'm writing for a paper, I don't have to give footnotes.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Khondker. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and we thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
It is my pleasure being with you and having this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for this interview.
Thank you for joining us through this journey through sociology with Dr. Habibul Khondker. Next week, our guest will be Dr. Vanita Sinha from the National University of Singapore.